and bandwidth issues, so requesting you to please turn your video and audio off. But yeah, please go ahead and introduce yourselves, guys. Who are you? Where you're speaking from? Why are you joining us on this call today? Also, the very important question that we requested you to do in your pre-work: what challenges did you face while understanding the concept of marginal product of labor? Yeah, so once again, just requesting you to feel free to share either by using your voice or in the chat. We will be beginning in the next 7 or 8 minutes. So for those of you who joined early, thank you very much for joining in, but feel free to answer the question right at the top of your window. What challenges did you face while understanding the concept of marginal product of labor?
Last time பண்ணத வந்து லாஸ்ட் டைம் பண்ணத தான் வச்சிருக்கோம். ஓகேவா? வால்யூம்னா இது வச்சுக்கோங்க. ஃபுல்லா தான் அவன் வந்து லாஸ்ட் டைம் என்ன பண்ணாங்களோ அதை எக்ஸ்பிளைன் பண்றாங்க. சப்போஸ் அவங்க கொஸ்டின் கேட்கணும்னா சாட்னு இருக்கு பாருங்க. அவங்க கொஸ்டின் கேட்கலாம். டீச்சர்ஸ் டைப் தான் பண்ணுங்க. ஓரலா கேட்க முடியாது. அவங்களோட வீடியோ வராது. ஓகேவா? என்ன போட்டுக்காச்சு? This webinar, pre-webinar presentation, webinar will be start 5:30. 5:30 தான் ஷார்ப் ஆகும். இது மட்டும் ஃபாலோ பண்ணிக்கலாம். ஓகேவா? இப்போதைக்கு நான் அப்படியே இருக்கட்டும், ஓடட்டும். இன்னும் 10 minutes கூட இல்லை, இன்னும் 5 minutes தான். அப்படியே இருக்கட்டும். நான் டிகாம்ஸ் கிட்ட சொல்லிட்டேன்.
Once again, good evening and welcome to our webinar on critical pedagogy and economics. Before we begin, thank you for coming and joining in early. We're 6 minutes ahead of time. We will begin at 5:30. In the pre-work that we sent to you in the invite, we asked you to go over a certain section of an economics chapter, and this is the question we'd like to ask you. What challenges did you face while understanding the concept of marginal product of labor when you were going over the chapter? Please feel free to share your responses in chat or over the mic. Additionally, we would really love to hear from you, who you are, your name, what brings you to this webinar. Yeah, and just feel free to even interact with Alex Thomas, who will be our expert today and is already on the call. So feel free to jump right in and talk to him as well. Once more, requesting you, if you're not sharing with the group, to please place yourselves on mute. And in order to save bandwidth, kindly switch off your videos. If, however, you feel like you want to share out loud, please take yourself off mute and share out loud with everybody. Thank you.
దీంట్లో కొంచెం హాట్స్పాట్ ఆన్ చేస్తారా నాకు?
Hello, I am Tarun Bhasin from Delhi. I am in.
Hello, Tarun. Thank you for joining us once again. We didn't catch the last bit of what you were saying. All we heard was your name. If you could just tell us where you said you're from Delhi. What brings you to this webinar, and what challenges did you face while understanding the concept of marginal product of labor?
Hello, did you get me?
Hello, we're only now beginning to hear you. Tarun, if you could just speak a little, tell us a little bit more.
Okay. I just submitted that this is a very new experience while coming through this app, that is a Zoom app, and I am here just to listen to others what they say about, and while they will be in the meeting, I'll be able to listen to them what exactly the discussion goes on.
Thank you for joining us, Tarun. Anybody else would like to also chip in and tell us who you are, where you're from, and I know it sounds like a Backstreet Boys song, but what challenges did you face while understanding the concept of marginal product of labor?
Hello. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
We can.
Yeah. Hello. So Raghunath here from Chennai.
Hi, Raghunath. If you could tell us a little bit more about yourself and your answer to the question.
Yeah. So I have an MA in economics, and at the moment I teach economics to students pursuing chartered accountancy, and I teach Indian economy to a bunch of individuals preparing for UPSC exams also.
That's great. Did you get a chance to go over the chapter on a marginal product of labor?
Yeah, I did. And these microeconomic concepts have been of abiding interest to me for a long time now. Not just micro, but the very subject of the micro foundations of macroeconomics, the whole controversy around that, and especially the evolution of these concepts, right, from the time of the classical political economy through the marginalist revolution, through the Keynesian revolution, and how today most of those concepts stand discredited and all that, right? There's so much happening, so much discussion happening. In fact, extremely heated discussions, and largely productive also around these concepts. Yeah, and regarding the marginal product of labor, I've been trying to grapple with this concept, and trying to understand this as a purely technical and accounting concept, vis-a-vis understanding it as an outcome of social relationships.
Sure.
And how do you actually teach students,
Makes sense.
Yeah, to be sensitive to the social conditions that determine the ways in which we measure the so-called marginal product.
Yeah, that's a very interesting thought, very interesting perspective. Hopefully, we're able to deep dive a little bit into that during the webinar. Even if we're not, Ms. Alex Thomas, who's going to be leading us today, will be happy to be in touch with us after this as well. So feel free to carry these conversations forward, etc.
Thank you.
It is 5:31. We will give it another 1 minute, and we will begin our webinar in exactly 5:32. In the meanwhile, we've heard from two individuals, Rohit and Raghunathan, if I'm right. And would love to hear from the rest of you. Feel free to put it into the chat window, who you are, where you're coming from, and what challenges did you face when understanding the concept of marginal product of labor. Prerna, requesting you to switch to the Firki screen in exactly 1 minute. Prerna, if you could kindly put on the Firki screen. Okay, we've got 29 participants, and that's a great start. So we're going to begin with our conversation. Good evening. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Firki's Critical Economics Pedagogy with Alex Thomas webinar. My name is Rahul Gomes, and I manage the course design and curation project on Firki, and I will help you navigate through the website today. Before we begin, we will go through a quick walkthrough of the Firki website. This is so that as teachers and educators, you are aware of the services the platform offers. In order to access the website, you will have to use your email ID and create an account on our website. This account is free to create and use, so it's easily accessible for everyone. Prerna, if you could please sign in. The Firki website offers teaching and pedagogy courses that are free of charge and easy to use. To register for a course, you can click on the courses button on the top left of your screen, as you can see right now. The courses there will allow you to choose based on difficulty level and categories such as planning and execution, vision and big goals, building relationships and investing others. Feel free to browse the different courses we have in our catalog using the search bar above. Yeah, we are adding new courses every month, so keep watching this space. Next up, we have the webinars page that is also accessible from the top of the screen. On this page, you will find information about upcoming webinars. If you scroll down, you will also find a bunch of resources from our older webinars, including video recording of the webinars itself, notes of the webinar, presentation of the speaker used, and other resources on the topic covered. Do feel free to browse through these sections at your leisure after the webinar tonight. The final section I will take you through is the resources page, also to be found in the top left corner of your screen. This page houses and will continue to house resources from several of our partner organizations such as the British Council, Khan Academy, Story Weaver by Pratham, and more. We are in the process of adding to this list, and you can easily filter resources by partner, grade, standard you teach, subject of instruction. We hope you find value in using these resources in your practice as teachers and educators. Finally, you can find the Firki app on the Play Store and can access these courses, webinars, and resources through your phone as well. So do download our app and stay connected to teaching and learning on the go. We have courses in Tamil, Kannada, and Marathi, and soon we will have courses in Hindi and Telugu as well. Okay, with that, let's move on to the webinar at hand today. Thank you for taking the time to join us in this discussion. In designing this and other webinars through the year, the Firki team is hoping that we can disseminate meaningful knowledge and skill that takes us closer to our goal of improving quality of education in Indian classrooms. This webinar will involve Mr. Thomas deepening our understanding on economics pedagogy through a chapter we were asked to read prior to the webinar itself. In this webinar, we will learn to teach abstract economic concepts effectively. We will understand the links between economic theory and policy and explore ways to situate economics alongside other school subjects like history, literature, math, and science. With that, let us begin today's webinar with an introduction of our speaker for the evening. Alex M. Thomas teaches economics at the Azim Premji University. He received his economics education from the universities of Madras, Hyderabad, and Sydney. He is currently writing an introductory macroeconomics textbook to be published by Cambridge University Press. On the subjects of economics education and teaching, he has co-authored the following articles: Rethinking Undergraduate Economics Education in 2018, Unlearning Economics in 2016, and Economics Textbooks as Commodities in 2012. We welcome him to our webinar and thank him for joining us today. This brings us to the norms for the webinar today. During the first 50 minutes or so, Mr. Thomas will take us through his presentation on critical economics pedagogy. During this time, he will interact with you through a series of questions. Feel free to reply via voice or chat. Post that 50 minutes time, there will be an open space to interact with and ask Mr. Thomas your questions on the topic at hand. Given the large audience that we are today, we request you to please keep your video and mic off to reduce stress on the bandwidth. Unmute it only when Mr. Thomas is taking questions and comments. To ask questions or clarify a doubt, please write in the chat box. Ashwath, who is our Firki lead, will be there to curate your questions and comments throughout the webinar. We will take them collectively at the end during the open space. Do remember that learning new things is often difficult, but challenge yourself and reflect on your thinking and experiences today. The best way to remember something is to write or discuss your learning with someone after the webinar as well. We have Prerna from the implementation team who is taking notes, a summary of which will be circulated to you after the webinar. We will have multiple opportunities to interact with our speaker, Mr. Thomas, throughout the call. Feel free to post questions in the chat window throughout the call, and Mr. Thomas will try and get through as many questions as possible at the very end. This webinar will be recorded and will be available on YouTube and the Firki website soon. That brings me to the end of my long introduction. I thank you for your patience, and I hope you have an interesting evening. Over to Mr. Thomas now. I'm truly excited to understand economics instruction from him.
Thanks, Rahul. Am I audible? Okay, I'll just share the PowerPoint. Is it visible or?
It's not visible right now, Alex.
Okay.
Yes, visible now. If you could kindly make it, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, we can see. Good to go.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, people at Firki, and also thank you everyone else who has made this time to come. And I know it's evening time and probably not the best time to listen to a lot of conversation, but I'll try and be as engaging as possible. So with that, let me just begin this. So This is some of the slides that I have here today is based on the questions I received a couple of days back. So I have sort of incorporated some of those questions in my presentation, but in case some of your questions still remain, feel free to ask me towards the end. So the kind of questions that we are interested in asking in economics, most recently demonetization, as most of us have been somewhat affected by it. The question of farm waiver, recently there's been much debate on that. How much should GST be? What is the rate of the sales tax? We've also discussed, or there's a lot of debate going on about what should the interest rate be. There's also a debate on whether tomato prices are falling. Are farmers able to actually get enough returns for their investment? And recently, there's been a lot of debate about whether the government has done enough to create jobs for all of us. And the question of inequality, it has not really surfaced, but I think that this is a question that we constantly keep addressing. And these are some of the issues that we see all around us. And whether as a class 8 student or whether as a teacher or a university faculty, we all face these issues. So in that sense, I think that there's a certain common thread running through all of us. Right? And of course, I should not forget that there's also a lot of ecological degradation, and especially I live in Bangalore, and Bangalore is one place I think that which is certainly facing ecological degradation. And what can economics really tell us about these issues? So then the question is, what is economics? There are many definitions of economics, and usually in school we go from Adam Smith to David Ricardo to Lionel Robbins to Samuelson. But the dominant view of economics is seen as a science of choice. Why am I eating this today, or why am I not eating something else? Why do I choose to attend this webinar and not go for a movie? Right? So these kinds of choices are seen to be central to this domain of economics. But it's not just a science of choice. That's not the only kind of definition that is available, but we also have other views. So you can also think of economics not just as a science of choice, but it is also a study of production, distribution, and consumption. It can also be a study of economic relations. And when I use the term relations, it means already that I'm talking about social and cultural factors. Right? So it is possible to think of economics not just as a science of choice, but as also having some sort of study of production and economic relations in there. So this is just to indicate to the viewers and to the listeners that it's not, there's not just one way of looking at economics, and there are multiple ways of looking at economics. Then the next question is, how is economics studied? So I'm just going to give two broad kind of classifications. So if you look at the key economists, so some names might be familiar to you, but because these are also shared for future, you can look them up later at your leisure. So some key economists and their definition. So if you adopt a science of choice definition, the methodology that is adopted is usually you start with an individual. Sometimes it's called a Robinson Crusoe economy because Robinson Crusoe was all alone in the island. But you often start with what is called a single individual. But if you adopt a different approach, let's say that you adopt a science of wealth definition of economics, which comes from Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and other people, you start with social classes. That is, let's say you start with landowners, or let's say that you start with capitalists or workers. Right? So this is a very, very different way of understanding the world, and your starting point differs. Now, there are several laws in both of these frameworks or schools of thought, but one of them is the idea of diminishing returns. And that is what we are going to briefly talk about when we discuss the marginal product of labor. In terms of theories, within the science of choice, you have the marginal productivity theory. Again, that I shall briefly discuss. But just to compare what we're going to discuss today with, let's say, an alternative way of understanding the world, you start with social classes. And one of the laws that Smith or Marx talks about, actually not so much Smith, but Ricardo and Marx talks about, is that there is an inverse relationship between wages and profits. More accurately, there is an inverse relationship between the real wage and the rate of profit. So what that really implies is that if workers try to bargain for a higher wage, it means that the capitalists will be forced to have less profits. In other words, there is some sort of a conflict that exists there. And so the theory, when it comes to the question of wages in this tradition of Ricardo, Marx, etc., is that of wage bargaining. There is no marginal productivity theory here, but what you have is that workers and owners or the capitalists come together and decide how much the wage should be set at. So in a way, like many other subjects or like sciences, we also use certain models or certain theories which provide explanation, which also tell us what causes what. Now, so why did tomato prices fall? What is the reason for it? Is it to do with rainfall, or is it the case that the farmers did not anticipate the demand correctly? Right? So what is it that leads to certain economic phenomena or something that we actually see around us? That's what models and theories are all about. But if I may paraphrase another British statistician, what he said was, all models are wrong, but some might be true. In the sense that necessarily because these are abstractions, it is certainly the case that not all elements of a model will correspond to our reality. But there'll be some aspects of it which enable us to understand what is happening around us. Now, when we construct a model, much like maybe physics uses the assumption of vacuum to say certain things definitively, we assume what is known as perfect competition. And the reason for this is simply that it allows easy tractability. It enables us to say certain things with precision and with a certain degree of definitiveness. However, we must realize that this is not the reality. What we have in the real world is some element of market imperfection, such as monopoly or oligopoly across the world. Now, any field of, so some of these, the reason I'm posing some of these questions in this manner is based on the nature of questions I've received. So maybe some of this is familiar to some of you, but any field of study requires its own definitions. I think this is very important, and people seem to confuse sometimes what is there in a subject like a discipline. It could be economics or it could be anything else. We have a certain commonsensical understanding of long run. For instance, I might think that long run is 5 years. My neighbor might think that my long run corresponds to 2 years. Whereas in economics, there is a very definite understanding of long run. And if you have gone through the pre-webinar sort of reading from NCERT, one of the definitions of it is that the textbook says if you can vary all factors of production, it means that you're operating in a long run. In other words, long run is a very, very precisely defined idea in economics. Then let's move to the question of investment that is used in macroeconomics. A lot of students often confuse investment with investing in shares. We invest in the stock market. That could be a certain form of investment, let's say in business studies or accounting. But in economics, when we talk about investment, we are really talking about additions to, let's say, machinery, additions to the stock of tools, additions to the plant, and in a way which generate some sort of employment or some sort of real investment, so to speak. Accounting is very important. Every subject, every domain has its own ways of accounting. The gross domestic product is one way in which it is some sort of an average measure of how well the economy is doing. And as maybe some of us know, that of course, like with any average, it will always be incomplete or it will always be unsatisfactory. So we need to have other ways of understanding it. Circular flow of income, I'm not going to touch that. There's also a certain vocabulary. I'm using the term vocabulary and not really jargon, because jargon somehow I think gives a negative connotation, as if people have intentionally decided to make things complicated. But I think that whether it is physics or whether it is mathematics or whether it is history or philosophy or economics, all these subjects have their own vocabulary. And for instance, and I think that part of the learning is for us to really understand what it means and convey that to the students. So for instance, we have this idea of marginal cost, which is what we are going to talk about more in depth. We also have the idea of aggregate demand. Right? But it is not just enough to take these things as given, but I think that we need to understand the evolution of the concept. As I think Raghunath, one of the participants, briefly mentioned before we started, I think trying to understand the history of a concept is extremely important. In a way, if some of you are interested in word origins or etymology, or some of you have a passion for words or language, I think that when you're trying to introduce any concept in economics or any other subject for that matter, it might be a useful exercise to trace the etymology. And in fact, I think that if you're also teaching students not in English but in other languages, it might also be a useful exercise to see if there's a corresponding word in the local language. And I think that these things make a lot of connection with the students and communicate these ideas much more forcefully. Now, I think that briefly this has been mentioned, but what is the motivation or the history behind so this talk? I think that I've tried to engage with this matter or question of how to teach and what should be taught at several levels. So in 2012, it was mainly a critique of or asking students or asking all of us to really question textbooks, because they are also commercially produced and distributed. So it is not necessarily the case that what we find in them is essentially some kind of distilled truths, not necessarily at least. In 2016, also the question was to look at the role of history and the role to be generally critical of these things. And in 2018, this was more to do with undergraduate economics education. And all this sort of brings me to 2019. And so when I was asked to do this, I thought, let me combine some of these thoughts together along with what might be useful in a school setting. I just want to alert you to that image there on the slide. It's actually drawn, it was drawn by one of my ex-students who was doing her undergrad in economics here. What we tried to sort of demonstrate was there is a certain struggle to escape from the dominant viewpoints. Now, these dominant viewpoints might be all around us, particularly in the form of textbooks, and it is a difficult, there is some sort of unlearning that is required. I'm just going to stop now and see if there are any questions, because I think there is some chat questions which are coming up, or I'll just...
There haven't been any questions so far, Alex, but might be a good time to just open it up and ask anyone if there are any specific questions or any thoughts that you'd like to share before we move on.
Yeah. So I think if there are any questions, see, usually, first of all, this is the first time I'm doing a webinar, and if it was a face-to-face communication, there would be more. I'm not able to see everyone engage, your expression. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them on chat or ask me now.
I will communicate all the questions that come in chat to you, Alex. So far, we're just helping a couple of people with their technical issues, etc. Okay. But I think we can go on. As soon as we have any questions, I'll let you know.
Okay. All right. So then I was thinking of a good title or something that is interesting that I could say today. And that's when I was aware of this book by Paulo Freire. Although I haven't read the book myself completely, there are some ideas that I have from it. And it is from this book or his own way of thinking about it that I've taken this term critical pedagogy. But when I went through it, I realized that, without really knowing Freire, I've touched upon some of these aspects in my previous writings too. But I thought that I'll give it a bit more coherence or shape by actually presenting to you what Freire's view is about. So, in a certain way, it is really a critical sensibility. Suppose I come to the classroom at Azim Premji University and I tell them that this is what the textbook tells you. If the students just believe that and not ask me any question about what is the source of that, where that question came from, it means that they sort of are just accepting whatever I tell them. And what I might be telling might be from a textbook or from another source. But so what we really want to inculcate is a certain critical approach. In a way, I think that it is, of course, it is difficult from the side of the instructor or the teacher. When we get a lot of questions, it also means that we need to have the time to be able to prepare and respond to them. But I think that given whatever is possible, it is still useful for the students, for their own learning and for our learning. I think if we enable them to actually question the dominant theory. And dominant theory in this context or in the school context is really what we teach them based on the textbook. And in a way, it is really to encourage questions. And often economics has been reduced to problem solving. I think that what we really need to also probably teach students is how do you construct a good problem? How do you frame a problem? And I think that this kind of an approach or something that it's really going down. We've emphasized so much on problem solving that we give a problem to them and ask them to solve it. But that is a bit too mechanical, I think. And what I feel that we should be teaching them is probably really how to frame appropriate questions given our surroundings. So the questions can be about assumptions. So for instance, if somebody asks a question about why perfect competition, we can tell them that it is an abstraction. It is not the reality, but it is used so that we can say certain things definitively. Questions about measurement. Right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about measurement when I get to the marginal product of labor. And I think most importantly, limitations. And I think it is this that really, if we talk more about the limitations and not really as something just for completion, but limitations is what brings this theory or the model alive in the minds of the students. Because that is when they're thinking, can this work here? Can this not work there? What are the limitations? Maybe it will work in a certain economy, maybe it doesn't work. Maybe it can work in certain times, but it doesn't work in other times. And I think that it is these limitations that ensure that we have really understood the model or the theory inside out. So this was as way of introduction and taking into account all the questions that were sort of posed. Now I'll get to, in the next 20 minutes or so, I'll get to most of the, what we are really based on the pre-work. So it's teaching abstract concepts. I'm going to talk a little bit about abstraction, focus on marginal product of labor. In a way, I'll talk a little bit about the connections between economic theory and policy in connection to marginal productivity theory, and which it has an implication for labor policy. Finally, I'll talk about economics in the company of other school subjects. And I'm just going to talk about literature, history, mathematics, and physics, very briefly. So about abstraction, there are different levels of abstraction in economics. And this I've already alluded to and mentioned before. Both are abstraction. Taking a social class is an abstraction, starting from an individual is an abstraction. But I think that it is important for students to know that there are different levels of abstraction and there's not just one kind of abstraction. And in certain contexts, maybe the class, taking the class at the starting point might be better. In certain other contexts, maybe the individual might be a better starting point. And remember that depending on the level or depending on what you choose at the starting point, it has an implication on your policy conclusion or your model recommendation. Again, the question is level of abstraction of, do you want, should we discuss this in the short run where we assume one factor of production is constant? Or do we want to talk about the long run where we relax that assumption and say that all factors of production are variable? In the economy, when we talk about inflation, we look at what is called consumer price index, we look at wholesale price index. they're all statistical averages. The theory behind it is really what happens to aggregate price level. There is a capital P that we often talk about in the realm of theory, which really is about all the prices somehow reduced to one single number, right? And but in reality, is there a question? Okay.
No, I think there was a.
All right, this is just disturbance. All right. So in reality, when we look at consumer price index or wholesale price index, it is very clear that it is just a proxy. It cannot capture what we really want in theory, which is the aggregate price level. So certain services are left out or certain commodities are left out. And this is the case with any kind of measurement when we move from a theoretical notion to an empirical notion or a statistical notion. We also have the idea of relative prices. Suppose I am a tomato farmer. I want to know what is the price of, let's say, my fertilizers relative to the tomatoes that I'm going to sell. Because, well, if the price of tomatoes fall and the price of fertilizers increase, it is a bad thing for me. And so we are also interested in what is called relative prices. And this can be applied in many different contexts. So there are different levels of abstraction, and I've just given a few examples here, really. Now, so at this point, I want to pause and ask a question to all the to the audience, which is that, do you think that factors of production, we often start with the statement that land, labor, capital, and sometimes organization are considered to be factors of production. Do you think it is an abstraction? So Rahul, if you can, I'm not able to see the chat box now. So if there are any responses to that, if you can just let me know.
Mukul says yes. We also had a couple of questions from earlier that we've made a note of. If you'd like to take now or later, we can take them later as well. But the only reply so far to this question is yes from Mukul. Anybody else?
Yeah, so I hope
production that be an abstraction. Yeah,
okay, it would be very helpful if you just need to type yes or no. Nothing else really. Even if you don't know, I would urge that you either go with yes or no.
Shubham says yes.
Rahul, I think there was a question previously which would help. I think earlier that what do you mean by abstraction itself? There was a little bit confusion on that. So maybe if Alex explain that a little bit, I think that will help to answer the question better. Thanks.
Yeah, I think you went, the previous slide was a little, there are a couple of questions. Even Vishwati is asking what is abstraction here exactly. If you could please clarify that. I think once that happens, we'll have a little more specific responses.
Right. Right. If we look around us, which is the reality, of course, we also have certain lenses that we put on when we look around us. But sometimes we might see that people behave in groups. Let's say that when workers are going to bargain, if there's a trade union, maybe there's a group. But in many private companies, such things are not allowed. So maybe you bargain just as an individual. Now, I might be a individual household in the sense that I might just be one person in a household, or maybe there are a group of people in a household. So how is the decision being made? So if I'm if I live in a household with a family of let's say 10 members, right? It doesn't make much sense to think of them as 10 individuals, because the decision probably is being made by one person and everybody else follows that. So in a way, when we start off by talking about an individual, we are saying that an individual is a utility maximizing individual, in the sense that each individual is able to decide for themselves what is good for them. But again, in the real world, it is still not clear. For instance, a good example is these days people say that it is better to give direct cash transfer to the woman in the household and not to the man, because the woman, apparently from research, it indicates that they take better care of the household or the needs of the children. But again, going back to the question of, so the reality is much more complex, but when we are trying to have a general theory of how the economy works, let's say how prices are determined, how quantities are determined, we need to have some starting point. And one of that is the idea of whether to start from an individual or to start from some kind of a group. So because, for instance, why is it that we take labor as a group? Because the belief is that people think that all of them have a common aim or a common goal, which is that they want decent employment, they want good wages. So it is possible for us to think of them as a social class. That's about the individual versus class thing. Now the question of short run and long run, again, in the real world, maybe at a certain point in time, you're tied for funds, the firm has no funds, so the firm is not able to expand production. Right? So maybe the plant that the firm has ordered from Sweden is going to take a year, which means that you're operating in some way a certain kind of short run. But maybe for another firm, which is an IT firm, let's say that you're constantly changing your capital and labor in the sense that you're always operating in the long run. Right? There might not really be a notion of a short run in the abstract sense of the term. But again, when we want to make certain definitive statements about what is happening to prices or what is happening to quantity, we are forced to resort to some kind of an assumption. We say that, okay, in the short run, some factors are fixed. In the long run, all factors are variable. Whereas in reality, we might be operating maybe always in the long run or maybe some mix of both. So anyway, that was my point, that you can have different levels of abstraction to talk about certain things. And this is something that is necessary. A good example is, for instance, if I want a map of India, if I were to draw it to scale, right, it doesn't make any sense. A map necessarily is a guide. Similarly, a theory or a model is also a guide to understanding what is happening around us. If there are, if this is not clear, please do ask.
No, thanks, Alex. That was very helpful, actually. Thank you.
Yeah, we've got some responses. Mamta also says it was helpful, so thank you very much.
Okay.
We've got another response on this question, factors of production. Arpit says imputed concepts like notional rent, etc., can be considered an abstraction, but when it comes to labor, maybe it's real and not just theoretical.
Okay. All right. So thanks for that. Yes, I think like most of you have said, factors of production is an abstraction. But I'm going to make this a bit more complicated now. So the question that I'm going to ask is is it possible when we talk of factors of production, there is a certain understanding that all of them are somehow on an equal footing? In a way, there is some sort of, it's not that one is more powerful than the other or nothing like that. All of them are treated on par with each other. So now my question is, do you think that we can, if you look at the real world, right? If you look at the real world, do you think that we can treat land, labor, and capital on an equal footing? So again, yes or no?
Lots of no's. Just a series of no's coming across right now.
Okay, excellent. All right. So the point to make really is the way the assumption goes, or the factors of production abstraction happens, is as if no kind of power dynamics exists. For instance, if you take the case of India, if you own a lot of land in Bangalore or any other city or any other rural area too, right? The owner of land occupies a powerful position. Now, to put a owner of land and an owner of labor together in the same footing, certainly there is something wrong. Now, the reason this happens is because you're starting with this idea of the individual without any further social relations embedded in that. Whereas if you, for instance, if you had started off with a social class, it is automatically clear that the landowner and the capitalist have much more power than the laborer. And this is very well known. And even somebody who people think is a champion of free markets, somebody like Adam Smith, also recognize that workers are sort of, I mean, for them to be better off, they need to come together in some context, right? So I think that it is very, very important, again, when we teach students so that they understand that, this is not, this is a certain abstraction that is being made. Next, the question is, how is, coming to question of measurement, how is land and labor measured, right? So land, again, okay, maybe I'll take this question up. If people can just tell me how, I mean, what are the units of measurement of land?
I'll let you know when I see anything.
Yeah,
but
yeah. Just like, I mean, if I have to measure speed, I might do, I don't know, kilometer per hour or something like that.
Hectares,
If I have to measure, right. Okay. So yes, so land has a natural unit of measurement that you might use, some area, I mean, some measurement of area to do that. Now the next question is, how is labor measured?
VVSS says labor wages, labor hours. I'm hearing not fixed number of people.
Okay, all right. So again, when it comes to labor, I mean, one would not, I mean, we would not say wages in the beginning, but one can say that you have a natural unit of measurement there. You can talk about the number of hours that one works or the number of days that one works. Right? So there is a natural unit of measurement for both land and labor. Now, the question to you is, how is capital measured? What is the unit? What are the units of measurement of capital? Again, this is, I'm assuming that all of you are familiar with the pre-reading, or at least the factors of production, which is land, labor, and capital. And then I want you to sort of respond based on that.
VVSS says in the form of interest. Shubham talks about percentage of share one holds. These are the two responses so far on capital.
Okay, so I might clarify a little bit. So I think share is, again, I think the capital that I'm talking about is not financial capital. But when we are talking about capital in the context of economics, we are really talking about productive assets which generate employment. So it could be plant, it could be machinery, it could be some, sophisticated equipment.
Another response is physical capital by amount of investment made. Interest, I think that goes back to your point from not the same capital.
Amount of investment made. Okay, so again, I'm just going to press this point. When we talk of land, labor, and capital, are we really talking about? We are not talking about investment in mutual funds. We are not talking about investment in the stock market. We are talking about, let's say that I am a firm and I need to start production. Let's say that I need to make idli, right? I need a big idli maker. I need the dough for idlis, right? And I need the stove, etc. So what would capital for a firm be? I mean, that's a question that I'm asking.
Hearing a couple of responses, Vishwajit talks about how the power it has to produce the next level or series of production. Raghi talks about aggregating different forms of capital is a tricky issue. Machinery, Pranati talks about how it is context dependent. Arpit talks about how it is cash reinvested. VVSS talks about tools required.
Tools. Okay.
Yeah, those are the things I'm hearing.
So we've so far discussed that land has a natural unit of measurement. When we talk of factors of production, land has some hectares or acres. Labor has some number of hours. But when it comes to capital, suddenly we are stuck because I think we don't, or all of us seem to have some sort of a confusion. Right? So what is happening? And I think this question is very central, and perhaps this is not something that we often discuss. Right. So, and I think anyway, one of you mentioned that there is a problem. There is a problem because if I'm a idli making unit, for me, capital refers to the idli maker. It refers to the stove that I need. It refers to all the implements that I need. Right. But then if I have to have a single measure of capital, right, what should I do? Let's say for this idli making firm, I need to arrive at a single measure of capital. What is it that I'm required to do to arrive at that figure?
Again, guys, feel free to take yourselves off mute and respond as well. You don't necessarily have to respond via the chat window alone. Having said that, Ragi said express it in monetary terms. VVSS says we need both the investment and the labor. Arpit Kotari talks about working capital needed.
Okay. All right. So anyway, I think that some of you are still coming from a very, financial background, but that's all right. So as one of you said, that you need to bring in prices. There is no way that I can add an idli maker and a stove to arrive at a single measure unless I multiply the price of the idli maker with its price and the stove with its price, right? So to arrive at some notion of capital in a meaningful manner for any firm, you need to introduce prices, right? So I think that this is very central because in a certain sense, one can say that capital does not have a natural unit of measurement like labor and land. And I think that this is the point that I wish to make here. So the concept of the production function is something that is there in the pre-reading, and the production function tells us that if you given a certain number of labor and a certain number of capital, we'll get a certain output. Right? That is also a certain kind of abstraction.
Alex, just a quick heads up. We are at 6:15. As you said, I'm just going to keep giving you a heads up from time to time.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So let's talk a little bit about the production function. So what we have written here is that output is a function of labor and capital. That is, labor and capital are inputs, and when you put those inputs in this function, you get a certain level of output. Now, how many of you have some background in mathematics? If you can just say yes or no quickly.
Yes, none, yes, no, yes. So there's a mixed, a few yeses, a couple of no's.
Okay. So, so probably if you're introducing this idea of the production function, I don't know, in class 10 or class 11 in school, it might be useful to sort of talk about relations and functions, which they learn in school, which they learn in mathematics, sorry. Right. So the reason is this is a functional form, and this is one way whereby I think that we can sort of get the students to talk across two subjects, at least in this context, mathematics and economics. And it might also be useful to see whether, what kind of strict assumptions are needed for it to be called a function. Right? The next question I've already asked, what are the units of measurement of labor and capital? So the next, what we do is we derive this marginal product of labor from the production function. Now, here I'm making a few jumps, and again, I'm doing that on the assumption that most of you have at least gone through it once or have some familiarity. Right. So you have the production function, which tells you how much output is produced, and we are able to derive what is called the marginal product of labor from the production function. You just assume that that's how we do it. We don't have to, at this point, at least it's not necessary. So in order to derive it, we take capital as constant. So if that is the case, just so that I know that we are on the same page, can you tell me if we are operating in the short run or the long run?
Ragi says short run. We've got one response. Short, more short, number of short.
Okay, at this point. Right. Yeah, right. So, so we are completely operating in the short run. But again, remember that, and I think the textbook also makes this very, very clear, and I think this is extremely important. The textbook says that the short run does not correspond to calendar time. Right? So what we talk about short run in theory, right, need not have any one-to-one correspondence with calendar time. That is, short run need not refer to 3 months, 10 months, 1 year. that there is no one-to-one correspondence between the idea of time in theory and the commonsensical idea of time that we use, which is number of months or weeks or years. Right? And I think the reason this is important is because often we see people use these terms very loosely, in the sense that they might take an implication from theory and use it incorrectly in policy making to say that in 2-3 months this will be fine because we are operating in the short run. But it is essential for us to maybe tell the students and for us to understand that there is no such one-to-one correspondence. Just like in physics, and when you have perfect competition, what we arrive at, that is, when you have conditions of perfect competition, that is, there are a large number of buyers and sellers, there is no barrier to entry and exit a market, and all those lot of assumptions. What you get under conditions of equilibrium is that the real wage is equal to the marginal product of labor. So I think for you, it is just important to remember that under conditions of equilibrium, what we arrive at is the real wage equals the marginal product of labor. And the reason the marginal product of labor is important, the concept is important because it is able to tell us something about real wages. Right? And real wages are absolutely important when it comes to day-to-day discussions about employment, about wages, about our access to education, access to health. I mean, a whole lot of issues that we've spoken about in the very first slide. Right? So this is just, I've written it out. Under conditions of equilibrium, what we arrive at is that the real wage is equal to the marginal product of labor. And this is often said to the students as a sort of a finding, a conclusion, or something that is true. So one way to motivate the discussion and in sort of keeping in line with the critical pedagogy, which I'm also applying in this presentation, the questions that can be posed is, why? I mean, so I've just titled as why keep capital constant and other questions. So why is it that, for instance, when we are talking about marginal product, what we are saying is, if we keep capital constant and we increase the units of labor, how much does total output increase? I'll repeat that. If we keep capital constant and we increase the number of labor, how much does total output increase? In other words, what we are asking is a if-then question. Sometimes this is also called a counterfactual, but what we are asking is potentially what happens. So maybe a student or I could ask, why are we interested in this question at all? Right? In the real world, are we making decisions based on this? It could be, but in all cases, are we making decisions based on this? So then I could ask a further follow-up question. If I'm a profit maximizing firm with enough resources, why would I keep capital constant? Right? Now, I mean, if I'm, let's say I have a small IT firm with 10 employees and 10 computers, and I'm a profit maximizing firm, will I be stupid enough to keep 10 computers and employ 20 people? So the question that I'm really asking is, I mean, what is it that, why are we interested in this question of potential change? Right? So again, when we are trying to deal with theory, I think that we should try and motivate and we should try and question each and every aspect of it. Of course, the other side, the flip side to all this is we might just end up asking questions and not reach anywhere. But I think that if we are able to train students to ask questions, train students to think critically, then I think that the learning will also be in a way more fundamental or more in more depth. There'll be more depth to that. As I said again, if you're a rational firm, and of course, assuming you have access to resources, why would a firm keep capital constant? Right. So this question. So if you look at the textbook, what we see is that the total output, or Y, in the production function is measured in physical terms. Now, this is interesting because, as we said before, if I'm talking about the production function for the entire Indian economy, right, we cannot really talk in physical terms. We could imagine certainly, a matrix or something like that, where you have, each and every output which is measured in, let's say, we say 2 computers, 5 idlis, 10 laptops, etc., etc. That is possible. But if you have to arrive at some meaningful figure for it, or a single figure for it, you need to bring in prices. Right? So then the question, another question that can be asked is, why are we measuring certain things in physical terms? So one response to that is, as economists, we are interested not so much in the first stage on increases in GDP because of prices, but we want to know if actual goods and services have increased. Because if actual goods and services have increased, it means that there is more available for us to consume. So in a way, the question that I pose to you is, does it make sense in the case of an aggregate production function? That is, when you're talking about the economy as a whole, it does not make much sense to talk of output measured in physical terms, because there might be a huge heterogeneous bundle of outputs that are being produced, which have to be sort of reduced to a common denominator by multiplying with their respective prices. So if you can look at that, the chart that I've taken is not very clear, but what I have there is really what is called a thought experiment. Thought experiments are devices that people like us, social scientists who do not have a laboratory, have to use, because it tells us something about what we are thinking, and it tells us also something about the real world. Now, the next kind of thing that we are moving on to is the law of diminishing marginal product. The question is, what is a scientific or a natural law? The way diminishing marginal product idea is represented in textbook with the prefix of a law might communicate to the student that this is some sort of a scientific fact. Again, this is something, in a way, what we are saying is that even if you repeat these instances, the same outcome holds. But in economics, what we have is not similar to what happens in biology or physics. This is not a law in that sense of the term. And so, because it is not a law in that sense of the term, this can be questioned and critiqued. And when we do these thought experiment or laboratory, we have the assistance of graphs and algebra, and that is what we generally do in school as well. So this is one slide where I've put up on the corner the book by David Ricardo, which was published in 1817 after Adam Smith. What is the history of this supposed law of diminishing marginal returns? In Ricardo, there was this idea that there is diminishing returns to land, because if you go on and on cultivating on the same piece of land, the fertility diminishes. But is land like labor or capital? They are very, very, very different entities. In fact, capital is a heterogeneous bundle of commodities even. So how does it make sense to extend an idea that makes sense in the context of land to all the other factors of production? So I'm just going to leave you with this question, and not really, there is a big answer to it, but except to state that, this kind of a transformation or an extension has serious problems. So here again, I have another chart. It's not very clear, but you can look at it later, which is the gender pay gap. It is very, very clear that for the kind of work that we do, men and women are paid very differently, and women are paid much lower than men. So the reality is there is wage differentials across gender. Now we can do it across caste, we can do it across regions, etc. But I'm just sticking to gender now. Also, the reality is that the CEO salaries are shooting across. They're just rising. Now, suppose you believe that in theory at least, that in equilibrium, your wages equal the marginal product of labor. Right? That is, if markets are free, if no rigidities are there, in equilibrium, you have a tendency where your real wage equals the marginal product of labor. If so, what would your policy suggestions be? One, automatically, right? We want everyone to get what they are contributing. So our solution would be to make the labor market more competitive. Now, what does that mean? It means that firms should be able to easily fire and hire workers. And that's one of the things. The other thing is you don't want many minimum wage policies, right? Because that means that there is a floor and firms should be able to reduce the wages to whatever extent they want. In a way, if you believe that in equilibrium, that wages equal marginal product of labor, what we are really teaching the students and believing for ourselves is that there is a very harmonious view of income distribution. Now, what do I mean by harmonious? What I mean by that is, under perfect competition, as a worker, I'll be paid what I'm contributing. As capital, whatever that might mean, you get rewards for that. Right? So in a way, there is no, so if you remember the slide that I showed earlier about Smith and Ricardo, there is no place for conflict, right? So everybody is happy with everybody else, and it does not really indicate, at least to me, one of the fundamental characteristics of today's society, which is that there is a certain conflict between labor and capital. Right? So the solution is also something geared towards that. So this is not a phrase that I think most of you would have come across, and it is intentionally put there to, of course, to spark some extreme reaction also. So usually when microeconomics is taught in schools or in universities, it is taught as something which is in a way objective, which is devoid of any kind of political inclinations, right? In the sense that there is nothing in the theory which is telling that this is what is good, right? We are not trying to say that. The theory is telling us what is actually happening or what is the reality. But my argument is that there is a certain politics to it, and I think that this might have come across already based on what I just discussed. In a way, it favors free labor markets, right? And remember, this is also tied to the idea of how factors of production are defined. It is also tied to the idea that you start from an individual and not really from a class. And in a way, it discourages collective bargaining, because if you want your market to be perfectly competitive, you don't want people to come together in any kind of bargain. Right? It also discourages minimum wage laws. And as I would say that, I think that microeconomics in a way has illegitimately extended Ricardo's idea to all factors of production. So, one might ask the question, what if this idea, real wage equals marginal product of labor, is wrong? And I think this is important, and this is the second part where I want to emphasize that how ideas have such a fundamental role to play in our worldviews, in the way we want to frame policies, on the way in which we want to vote for certain parties or certain individuals or not. So what we really think is based on what we sometimes learn about how the world works, based on these ideas, and policies really shape our reality. In that sense, ideas are extremely powerful. And sometimes I use this example in class about this movie Inception, right? So you plant an idea in somebody's head, and textbooks are experts at that, and school education is also very good at that, or any kind of education, right? And these then have a very important function. Right, so this is, we are reaching the end. So I think I'll take just about another 5 more minutes and I'll wrap it up. So what is critical pedagogy then? So I've taken you to different aspects of how one can question these ideas. And one of them is to always keep our reality at the forefront. Even if a textbook, even if a teacher is telling you that this is how it is, I think that we should never forget what the reality is. And there should be a constant engagement between what we see around us and what is being taught. Now, not just in economics, I think any subject. We should also be very aware of what kind of policy implications arise from any theory that we teach. I think it is also very important, as I've shown, this illegitimate extension of Ricardo's idea. And for that reason, I think it would be good if our textbooks could also incorporate some notions of how this idea has come about, some history. Right? We should also be teaching the students about what the limitations are of any theory. And fundamentally, I think that we should teach students to question the textbook. I think that this is absolutely important, and it leads to much more engagement with the textbook than we don't see it as something like, something which we can't engage with. Right? So when we engage with it, probably the students or the teachers might be able to get even better notes and better ways of explaining things. So finally, this is the last, I'm just going to give you some short comments on this, really in relation to other subjects. One is mathematics. I've already mentioned that we can bring in functions, of course, graphs. And at later levels, sometimes you can also talk of how calculus is being used in economics, and we can make a connection between the two. In physics, the idea of equilibrium that economists have taken really comes from physics. And I don't know if some of you know this, but initially economics was called political economy when Adam Smith and David Ricardo were writing. And at, around later 1800s, people wanted it to be more scientific. So we changed the name from political economy to economics. The IC is somewhat resembling physics. So the idea of equilibrium comes from mechanics, that it is a state of rest. Right? So we've borrowed that idea. So that it's from mechanics. In biology, the connections actually go all the way back to 1600s when David Harvey discovered the circulation of blood. So the idea that money flows in the economy really comes, or the idea of what is called the body politic. Right? It really comes from the human body. The analogy is really the circulation of blood in the human body. So even the idea of inflation maybe can be connected. And I've already mentioned, I think history is very important in two aspects. One, I think that we can engage with the discipline or the subject of history to trace how an idea has come about. It can be a joint exercise, maybe between an economics teacher or an economics class and a history class. Maybe we can give an assignment that why don't you trace this idea, right, over time. It is also the economic history. What is the social and political condition of a certain time period. And with respect to literature, I think there are a lot of things which are important, which cannot really be quantified. But they also influence our behavior, influence what we do. They could be a sense of duty, they could be sympathy, right? It could be trust, and it is very, very, very difficult to really reduce them to some quantitative notion. And I think in that context, reading good literature will enable us to really have a better sense of even economics. So finally, just a couple of slides more. Some of you had asked for books, so I thought that I'll just put them up here and briefly comment on them. So if you want to know more about the Indian economy, and so you can read this text, which is called A Primer of India Economics. If you are interested in how economics has evolved, which is a very accessible book by Heinz Kutz, and I think that it's important for students to realize that there are many Indian economists who have contributed significantly to theory, right? So if you look at this book, it's a conversational style, and maybe you can give an excerpt to the student who can read it and feel good that I might also be able to do similar things, right? The other one is actually a reference book. I would not recommend. I would recommend the library buy it, but not individual teachers. It's really where you can find data relating to different aspects of the Indian economy. If you want to know about education, what are the different agencies which publish data on education? Let's see so these are some further resources, but because it's on the slide, I don't think that I'll comment on it much. But there was one question about how can you use technology to teach economics. So this further resources, one is written by a colleague of mine called Paper Plane Factory. where he uses, there's a game in class to teach the idea of diminishing marginal product. Or one can also look at this freely available text called Core Econ, which has interactive graphs. So you can change the graph and it's much more interactive and it's freely available. So this is what I want to end today's webinar with, is what Joan Robinson, who is an exceptional economist, actually said about why we study economics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. We've ended a little early, which gives us time to field some questions and some thoughts. We've got a few coming in, but I'd like to start by thanking you for sharing your thoughts with us. I'm just gonna shoot then at you some of the questions that we've already received. In the meanwhile, I'd like to suggest to everyone present here today, please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask the questions that you have, or enter your questions into chat. We will take them one after the other. Also, feel free to add and chip into a conversation. A lot of you are mentioning a lot of I see Manish has mentioned a book in the chat that he would advise everyone to read as well. How is Economics Private and Public Choice by Gwatney, Stroop and McPherson. Similarly, would like to hear from you as well in the chat or out loud. In the meanwhile, let's start with these questions one by one. Mamta, initially at the very beginning, asked a question that I think even Ekta had something to say about, but can we say then economics is looking at one thing from multiple perspectives? And how does that affect the way we approach its instruction?
Yeah, so in a way, if you go with the dominant idea of economics, it is looking at economics from one perspective, which is that of an individual utility maximizer or an individual firm who maximizes profit perspective. So what you really get is a single perspective, but there are developments there. Now so if you initially assume perfect information, people have tried to bring in, say that there is imperfect information. People have tried to say that, for instance, in this field called game theory, if there is repeated interaction with a person, you might behave in a different way. So there have been modifications, but nothing really fundamentally different.
Thank you very much. We're just going to move on, and Mamta, if that helps, please let us know. If you'd like to ask a follow-up question, also please let us know. Shaunak asked the question: can you explain what is dominant theory, and if in order to get our students to critically engage with what is dominant theory, how do we assess what is dominant theory in general?
Okay, so I think that's it's an important question, but the dominant theory, the way I would look at it, is more than school textbooks, because school textbooks are often written from different perspectives, and I've looked at some of them. But to understand the dominant textbook, the best is probably to take the book in undergraduate economics, which sells the most in the world. Does anybody know the answer to that question? If not, I'll tell you the answer. Anybody who wants to take a guess, which do you think, whose book do you think sells the most? Yeah, that's right. Raghunath has got it. It's Gregory Mankiw, who teaches at Harvard University. Right. So if you take that book and if you go through it, that to me is the idea of dominant economics.
Thank you very much. Shaunak, I hope that answers your question. Again, feel free to follow that up with a follow-up question. Biswajit asked this question twice. I think was very eager to get your take on this. Biswajit's question is that Marx said capitalism will eventually be replaced by socialism, and wants to know your take on that.
Yeah, see, my response to that is, I would not respond to it, because what we are really now entering, or you're asking me to comment on, is, I need to really some kind of a forecast, which I'm a bit reluctant to do in general. But I would sort of change the question a little bit and, ask myself, reformulate the question. Why is it that, or let's ask you, why is it that Marx is not taught in economics generally? Right? Is it the case that people are afraid? Because ideas are powerful. Is it that people think that suddenly students will, all revolt and, shut up the school or something like that? But what is it that makes us, or us collectively, reluctant to engage with different kinds of ideas, whether it is Marx or whether it's Hayek or whoever it is? Right? So I'm not going to comment on, because that's not really the core of today's session. But if you want to ask a question separately over email, I'll be happy to respond.
Once again, Bishwa, thank you for your question. And again, feel free to follow up with that. And definitely we'll share Alex's email ID with you. Feel free to get into correspondence on that particular topic, slightly controversial. Finally, VVSS has this question. We've gone from abstract and political to something very specific. Can you suggest topics other than GST that we can integrate with computer science projects?
Okay. So by computer science, I'm sort of assuming that it's some sort of programming or coding or something like that, right? So one is, of course, big data. Now, the National Sample Survey Organizations publishes unit level data on what different individuals or households are consuming, etc. So if you want to compile them, it calls for some understanding of data management and data analysis. Or the other option is, now there is also something called network theory. I mean, there are many different small developments in economics, a lot of it which deal with data and how to make use of such vast amounts of data. Right? But the other kind is more mathematical modeling. Right? So suppose you think of the entire economy as a network. Let's say there are trade networks, there are other kinds of networks. How do you model that? So you'll have your nodes, you'll have your trees, or how interconnected they are. So that's something that can be done. But you can also, I think that it really depends on what kind of a computer science project, I think.
Thank you very much. At this point, we've run out of all the actual questions that have come up so far in the chat window. Great opportunity to actually put out your thoughts right now. We've got one from Ragi right now. Value judgments are central to economics, and individuals have different value judgments that stem from their biases. How to alert students to their own biases and make them rethink how to engage with them critically. Very, very interesting. Very.
Some of my colleagues do this exercise that they give out, a set of questions saying, what do you think about how much women should earn? What do you think about who should do this? So a set of questions which I think are connected, so you can't try to game it too much. So this gives an idea of what really people's own value judgments are. And I think that these kinds of exercises are available online also to use, but they really, I think once the student completes that and gives it back, as an instructor, you get a good idea of what the value judgments are. So depending on what value judgments you're interested in, whether it is that women should always be paid less than men, many people might think that. But so you can really understand these if you formulate a questionnaire and then share it in class. And I've heard that it works really well. So people become then aware of their own preconceived notions.
Thank you very much. Again, guys, feel free to add in your questions in the chat window. A question I'd like to place to the group at large is, what are you taking away from this conversation? How do you intend to use what we've learned today, what we've engaged with today in your practice as teachers, educators, parents, policymakers, perhaps? Feel free to share that with us, either by giving voice or by sharing it in the chat window. A question that I had for Alex in general, and this is my question as well, is it's very interesting. I've been thinking a little bit about making students aware of policy implications of theory, as well as getting students to critically engage with reality versus theory. And are there any specific concrete ways or concrete practices as an educator, as a teacher, we can use in the classroom other than just getting them to question what is dominant at the time? Or just being, having a critiquing, having the lens of critique? Is there any other specific way or any method that we can use deliberately to engage students in critical thought?
So I think that because we don't have a laboratory, and this is what I tell my students too, what we need the students to do is really understand their surroundings. and what is happening, which means that I think reading the newspapers in a way, at least some aspects of it becomes important, because there is, I mean, unlike in biology, we can't go to a bio lab or chemistry lab to really trace out these things. So I think the only way it works is for students to have a good engagement with what is happening, at least in terms of economics and other kinds of things, and then asking them to maybe bring that to the class where we are discussing this theory, and so let the two collide. And let's not somewhat always favor theory over practice, or let's not favor what they're bringing into the class over, but let them come together and let's make better meaning of both.
Sure, thank you very much. Guys, any other thoughts, any other questions that you'd like to place to Alex? We've got another 10 minutes where we can take these questions. So once again, questions I have for the group at large is, what have you learned today? Anything new? How do you plan to use it in your life as a teacher, as an educator, as a parent? Feel free to share that with us out loud or on the chat window.
So I think, I'm sorry, I just read a question from Ekta, I think, in the sense of how can a teacher prepare oneself to ask such questions? Now that is a very difficult question because I think personally, because of my engagement with, the kind of education I've received and my engagement with history of economic thought and, my own teachers posing certain questions and being introduced to some of these things, I have been able to come up with my own list of questions. But I think that if probably a group of teachers come together and have this as a purpose, like let's formulate a set of questions to interrogate the textbook, and maybe over time when students raise questions, we compile them, and I think that over time we will be able to ensure that we have a good set of questions with us.
A question I had for you was, did we ever get to the bottom of why tomato prices did drop?
No.
Okay.
No, we didn't. So we didn't really talk about any of those things because all these answers in a way are contingent on what is actually happening. So this was just to motivate that.
Sure. Once again, guys, looking forward to your questions and thoughts. We've got another 7-8 minutes to go. Arpit asks, what are some innovative ways to teach economics in school?
See, I'm a bit reluctant to use the term innovative because I think that a lot of us have learned very good lessons from our teachers who did not have really anything apart from a blackboard and a chalk. Right? So I think the innovation is probably not so much to do with technology, but it is really how we want, what is it that we want the student to learn, and how do we ask, somewhat interesting questions? How do we get them to think outside the class? How do we connect these things with what is happening outside? I might use a blackboard to do it. You might use a PowerPoint to do it. Somebody else might show a movie. Somebody else might read a book. Now, I think that all these are innovations, in a loose sense of the term. But it is really, I think, how do we get the students to really think and engage? And I think there are just multiple ways, and depending on where we come from, what resources we have. So I think that it's really about how we want to use what we know, in a more critical fashion in the classroom.
Makes sense. Any other thoughts? Still, we have a few more minutes, and yes.
And if I may add, at least this is something that I do in class, that sometimes when students ask me a question and I don't know the answer, which happens, so I tell them I don't know, and immediately I won't know the answer because I haven't thought about it. Sometimes they're asking something I haven't thought about it. So I think that sometimes it's useful for us teachers to communicate to the student that it's not the case that we know all the answers, but what we do know is maybe with time we can find out the answer and communicate that. And similarly, I feel that if we are able to communicate to the student that they can ask questions of the textbook, just like they ask questions in class to the teacher, I think that would be that would be a very good thing to happen.
Sure. Thank you very much, Alex. Once again, we would love for your questions. Keep them coming in. In the meanwhile, I'd like to thank Mr. Thomas for being generous with his time and expertise today. Alex, can you please share your thoughts on this process, on your experience with the webinar and with engaging with people on the topic that you are an expert in, you enjoy as well? Any thoughts that you've had through today over the last 1.5 hours?
Okay, I was not prepared to say anything, but you've caught me at a. No, I mean, it's just that it's my first experience, and I don't know how this chat is okay, but it would have been good if I think there was more. I mean, I don't know, maybe oral discussion. But apart from that, I thought. I mean, it's difficult for me to say how things went, and that's why I'm not really able to comment on anything because I don't have the data, because I can't see people's faces, and I don't know, how. So I'll just wait for the feedback, and then probably I can communicate to you. But it can be made public if you wish. So.
Sure. Thank you very much. Once again, looking for your questions, your thoughts. Those of you who've come, thank you very much for coming in today. As Mr. Alex said at the very beginning, and I made a note of this just to remind myself that economics is the science of choice, and the choice was between this webinar and anything else, including a movie, and you made the choice to be here, so thank you very much. I would like to remind you that our next webinar is scheduled to take place on the 3rd of April with Khan Academy. So keep looking for emails from Firki in your inboxes for information on this upcoming webinar. In the meanwhile, for those of you who've come today, we'd like to thank you for being here. We've got another 2 or 3 minutes. So if you have any specific questions, please feel free to drop them in, and Alex will be taking them now. But other than that, thank you very much for being a part of our webinar today. Again, feel free to join in through voice. You don't have to necessarily chat in. You can unmute yourself and ask questions as well. Okay, I don't see any more questions coming in. So we're going to wrap up 2 minutes ahead of time. Once again, just a quick reminder, the Google form for the Google feedback form is in your chat windows now. I request everyone to please take 2 minutes to share your feedback before you leave. It will help us design the next webinar as well. Thank you everyone for joining in. Thank you, Alex, for joining as well.
Thanks, Rahul. Thanks, Ekta.
I think Ekta, somehow, I think her internet may have not been permissive. I think she's dropped off. But thank you very much for joining us, and have a great evening, all of you.